Between 1980 and 2018, we built more homes in Burnley and Doncaster than we did in Oxford and Cambridge. And if you ask which areas are growing, where is the demand for housing, something has gone horribly wrong there. Welfare spending has ballooned out of control since COVID. And we're talking here about working age welfare effectively, so not pensions and benefits for older people. We're talking about things for those who are broadly working aged.
Hello and welcome to the Institute of Economic Affairs podcast. I'm Callum Price, Director of Communications here. Today I'm joined by our Editorial Director, Kristian Niemietz, and our Executive Director, Tom Clougherty. Now there's plenty to get into, but before we do, we'd like to remind you to subscribe to our Substack at insider.iea.org.uk, where you can get all of your IEA content straight into your inbox. Plenty going on this week again, with Rachel Reeves and welfare cuts, employment rights bill additions, and what is the government actually going to do, and is it going to be enough on planning? Tom, I'd like to start with the welfare stuff. Rachel Reeves has this week all but confirmed that there's going to be some welfare, some cuts to the welfare budget. The spring statement is coming up in a few weeks. She's repeatedly sticking to those self-imposed fiscal rules, but she's lost her headroom from things that we've already covered in this podcast multiple times. So what do you think is the problem with welfare? Why is welfare always the area of focus for government cuts? And do you think she's going to actually be able to do anything about it?
Well, I'll take the last one first. I think, yes, the government, if they've got the will to do it, they will be able to do something on welfare spending because it really has ballooned out of control since COVID. And we're talking here about working age welfare effectively, so not pensions and benefits for older people. We're talking about things for those who are broadly working age, so universal credit and all of the associated add-ons to that system. I think where we've seen particular growth, though, over the last few years has been in the health-related benefits. So that's up by more than a quarter since COVID. So things like PIP, the personal independence payment, the work capability assessment. And this is largely, I think, a question not of people being significantly sicker or having significantly more sick people around than we did 5 years ago. This is basically a question of, on the one hand, it has become much easier for people to claim these benefits. Secondly, knowledge of how to claim those benefits and indeed how to game the system has become much more widespread online. So there are all kinds of places on the internet you can go to find out, to watch videos about how do you make sure you get your personal independence payment and so on. I think it's always important to stress when we talk about these things, there are people who are, genuinely suffering from disabilities or debilitating health conditions who do need the additional support. And that's probably reasonable. We may disagree as free marketeers or libertarians about exactly the best way and the best level at which to provide that support. But I don't think that we're talking, and I don't think the government will be going after people who are making very genuine claims. I think what they will try and target is eligibility, it's gaming. And I think they really will have to look at the fact that we've just had this massive explosion, particularly among young people, claiming mental health issues that prevent them from being able to work or which require them to need additional support in their lives. Again, the massive tripling that we've seen since the pandemic, I don't think can be realistically explained by people actually being, really worse off or really struggling more psychologically than they did in the past. This is largely a question, I think, of overdiagnosis and overexpanded eligibility for the benefits.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. That's always the case when you have, firstly, some groups being much more heavily represented in the statistics than others. In this case, there has been specifically an increase among younger people in their 20s, and I can't see an obvious reason why they should be affected worse by anything than people in their 40s. So there is that, and also the break in the time series, that it is really since the pandemic, as opposed to, say, a gradual increase over time where you could think, well, maybe something has changed, maybe in the wider social determinants of health, something of that sort. But when you have such clearly identifiable breaks in the series and differences between different subgroups that really should not be very different, that's when that shows you, okay, yes, you want to preserve, you want people who with genuine health needs, disabilities, you want them to be able to rely on a support system. But there must also be some overuse of the system. Otherwise, we wouldn't see this particular pattern in the data.
Yeah, and I think there's always this constant push and pull over time in welfare policy. And I think we've done a reasonably good job in this country. It was imperfect, but it was an improvement over what had come before in terms of trying to get rid of the perverse incentives, or at least to minimise them as much as possible, to create these work requirements so that people just couldn't go on benefits forever and never have to work again, that they would have to show that they were willing to look for jobs actively, genuinely. I think all of that stuff has fallen away in recent years, I mean, particularly during the pandemic. And you've got to bear in mind when COVID hit that I think there was a real shift because government all of a sudden, it wasn't trying to limit the amount of benefits it was giving out. It was actually thinking, how do we get money to people faster? How do we relax the eligibility requirements as much as we can? And I think we've never got back to where we were before, which, as I say, was not perfect. It still needed improvement. But in a way, it's a shame. It's a shame, I think, that the introduction of universal credit, which was a good idea, not necessarily brilliantly implemented, but still an improvement on the kind of labyrinthine system of welfare that had come before. It stalled, it ran out of steam, and then it's been eroded. So the whole idea was over time that you would gradually merge more and more benefits into this one very simple universal credit, which would be tapered away at a standard rate as your income rose. Now, that taper rate was and is really too high. If you look at it from the standpoint of economic incentives, it still does discourage people who have limited earning power from going to work rather than claiming the benefits, at least at the margin. Nevertheless, that was a sensible approach, and it was one that we could have built on. Unfortunately, it ran out of steam, as I say, and then post-COVID, I think the whole thing has really fallen apart. It's quite encouraging, though, to see the government looking at this, and I think that they are actually going to do something genuine. I mean, there's been talk for a while about Liz Kendall, who's the Work and Pension Secretary, looking at quite radical welfare reforms. Radical in the sense, at least, that the Tories might have been scared to go there. They might not be radical in IEA terms. But so then if the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, at the spring statement is looking to save, the reports in the newspapers, for like 5-6 billion annually from the welfare bill, I think that is wholly achievable as a short-term measure, largely by targeting the kind of things that we've talked about. But we've got to bear in mind the bigger picture and the longer term here. I kind of think that there's a short-term thing, which we've talked about. There's a medium-term thing when it comes to benefits, which I think is about housing benefit and how we try and reduce that absolutely gigantic bill. And then longer term, it's our old friend, the aging population, and the enormous impact that that's going to have, even just on current policy settings over the coming decades, adding effectively another 10 percentage points of GDP to public spending, something that would require effectively doubling income tax. So pretty serious stuff, right? So let's deal with the short-term thing. Let's try and clamp down on eligibility, eliminate the gaming. Let's try and fix the incentives as much as it's possible to do. And it's always difficult when you're dealing with things like single parents with low earning power, people with severe disabilities, and so on. You've got to recognise that there's no perfect solution to a lot of these problems, but we can make it a lot better than it is. Then I think you've got to look at housing benefit, but then we do have to be thinking, because the time that it really starts to bite will be on us much sooner than we think, about the biggest, most expensive, and in the long run, most dangerous bit of the welfare state, which is how we treat people in retirement.
And this comes back to things we've spoken about multiple times in this podcast, but we will keep speaking about, which is what should the state be doing. And we are, and you're right that those questions, as the population gets older, will come quicker than we think. But they're already happening this week with all the defence questions and the defence issues and throwing up that question of defence spending. And then you compare the budgets for things like welfare compared to things that we think that the state should absolutely be doing and better, like policing. So the increase in non-pension welfare spending since 2019 has been about 70 billion. You could sort of fund the police 5 times over with that amount of money.
And it is somewhat counterintuitive because, okay, we all know we have an aging population. You expect increases in the long term in old age benefits, in social care spending, and healthcare spending, because that is very heavily skewed towards the older cohorts. Those are things that we expect, but that we also have that a big driver at the moment is really the increase in benefits for working age people. That runs counter to and it comes on top of the long-term issues that we're already dealing with. And that makes it all the more important to keep an eye on that bill, because this is the part where you could say, well, at least here, we have some influence over this. We can't easily change the demographic makeup of the country, but for a subgroup where the vast majority should be capable of doing some work, that should be politically doable.
Yeah.
And it certainly seems like this is a question that is going to be at the forefront of whatever. If the sort of perfect radical government came in and fixed the country, in a sort of parallel way to, for example, Margaret Thatcher, although what she did wasn't necessarily perfect, etc., but she came in, did something radical on privatisation and monetary policy, etc. We don't need another Thatcher to do those things now. One thing Thatcher didn't do was touch the welfare state, really, but clearly that is the sort of area of focus for people that want a functioning, dynamic, growing economy to be looking at.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think, by the way, there was a piece by Jana Ganesh in the FT this week, which is really interesting because, yes, ideally you would have someone come in with a real kind of reformist fervour to try and tackle these issues in quite a fundamental way and move in a much more free market direction. But the point that Jana was making in his FT column was that actually what's going on in geopolitics might force governments' hands a little bit, and it probably won't lead them to be as radical as we might like. But nevertheless, there's a possibility for change sort of being just forced on governments in a way. And, he approaches this from the European perspective, and he says, how has Europe managed to have such high social welfare spending? And it's easy to take that for granted and think that it is just the nature of things. But actually, he suggests, this is quite historically contingent. It depended on a US security guarantee, which meant that European countries didn't have to spend as much defending themselves as they otherwise would.
Over which there's a huge question mark right now.
A huge question mark at the moment. Having a relatively much younger population, or at least a healthier population pyramid with more people working age, fewer people in retirement. And secondly, no real economic competition from Asia, from India and China until relatively recent decades. So a Europe which is protected by America, which has a youngish population and doesn't really have much global economic competition. Maybe it can get away with high taxes and high welfare spending. That doesn't seem to be the case maybe anymore. So, something possibly has to change there. And look, it's when you talk about a government coming in and being radical and addressing these issues, it's easy to do it in kind of the broad brushstrokes. So, with an aging population, what you really need is to come up with a way of making sure that people accumulate a lot more savings over the course of their lifetime, which can be drawn on to pay for them in retirement. Now, it may not be them accruing those savings individually. It may be through insurance funds. It may indeed be through government in certain cases. But we need to shift from a system which is effectively pay as you go, where today's workers pay for today's retirees, where instead today's retirees have already paid for themselves through accumulation during their working life. The tricky part is how you manage the transition, because you may have noticed the problem there, that there will be a generation of workers who are still paying for the older folks and they're trying to pay for themselves when they become older folks as well. That's tricky. Now, it has been done in various ways in various places, but there's a challenge there. If you look at something like housing benefit, which I said was the medium-term challenge, yes, there are ways you can reform the benefit system there. The crucial one, though, is reforming land use so that we can build a lot more, so that rents are lower, and so that for less well-off people, housing costs won't be so seemingly astronomical that they need the government to pay for them. The thing that I think is really interesting on this working age welfare point is whether we can just sort of pursue the logic of universal credit, of rolling as many things into one as possible, simplifying. And then I think the real trick is merging the benefits system with the tax system as much as possible. So you eliminate the bit where the tax system and the welfare system overlap, where you almost inevitably get extremely high effective marginal tax rates that destroy the incentive to work.
Yeah, I used to write a lot about this in the past. Can't remember the details now, but I was trying to apply the old Friedmanite idea of a negative income tax to the British situation. They kind of tried that a bit with working tax credit, but of course there it created exactly, or it kept exactly that problem, that you have lots of people who pay taxes and at the same time receive working tax credit. And why not integrate the two so that to make sure that you are either a taxpayer or you are a benefit recipient, but where at least for direct benefits, for cash benefits, you can make sure that you cannot be both at the same time, where it's either or. You either pay taxes or you receive benefits. And that's where, if you smoothen things out in this way, you could at least get rid of these very high implicit marginal tax rates, where people who work for another few hours a week would not see much change in their net income. That's something that can be sorted out, can be straightened.
Yeah, I think that's a important point to land on, that this isn't necessarily sort of free market critique of what's happening in the welfare state isn't necessarily a critique of scroungers and fraudsters. It's a critique of a system in which the incentives are such that somebody could be earning more on benefits than they would be earning in work, or indeed, at least getting into work wouldn't pay nearly as much as it should be.
I mean, both problems exist.
Well, yes, yeah,
right. And I think if you have a bad system, it will encourage both of those things. It's both the very rational, understandable decision to decide, well, I'll stay home, look after my family, and take the benefits instead of going out to work because it just makes more sense for me. And also I'm just going to take advantage of this system that I found using the advice that I've come across on the internet and everything else.
Yeah, and often the more complex a system is, the easier it is to find loopholes into to exacerbate. But you mentioned land use planning, and so that which brings us nicely onto our next topic. To ask effectively the fundamental question, as is being asked elsewhere, the government's plans to reform planning, to get Britain building, etc., etc. Will they be enough? Are they nearly at the scale that we need them to be? We are still waiting to see the planning bill come into Parliament, but lots of it has already been pre-briefed and pre-announced. Kristian, what's your view?
Well, at the moment, they're relying mostly on pressure from the top, from the center. And if you want to see some changes quickly, you have to do that, because reforming the system root and branch would take several years, and then more years until we actually see that in the house building numbers. They want to see some change fast, and that's perfectly understandable. It's just that if you rely on measures like the housing targets that are imposed from the top, the issue there is that, well, it works as long as you have a government that has the political will and the political capital to do that. If you then have either a changing government or simply the existing government running out of steam, changing its priorities, getting distracted by other things, then any progress you make comes to a halt. And what you don't get if you do it in this way is a system where essentially the government can lean back and say, we've sorted this out, and now this is a self-steering, self-coordinating system. It no longer needs constant ongoing management by the government of the day. You would ideally move to a system that runs itself, and where it doesn't matter so much who exactly is in government, what exactly their priorities of the day are, where you just have a system that works at the local level and on the ground with little involvement from the center, and we're not seeing that yet. We're seeing focus from the top, from the center, saying firstly we want less resistance, less lawfare, less malicious obstructionism, and that's great, and you have to start with that way. But again, these priorities can change, and the political process is unstable. The political mood is just, you get mood swings from one day to the next. So it's just an unstable system that we have right now.
Yeah. I mean, again, I think there's a good piece in the Britain section of The Economist this week, which is basically suggesting that Labour has the right intentions and strong rhetoric on housing and planning reform. And I think I would read the article this way, that it's the most important and impactful thing they can do economically. But maybe they're going to blow it because they're not being bold enough, despite the rhetoric, despite the big majority, despite everything else. And so I think the way it's framed is that essentially the government isn't fundamentally fixing the system. They're trying to make the system work a little bit better in the sort of short-term hope of just hitting the 1.5 million additional homes target over the course of the Parliament, which I suspect is not really ambitious enough and not what you would get in a properly functioning market.
Well, it's
anyway.
about half of what you need to hit the European average for homes, isn't it?
Right, yeah. And so, I mean, I think that there's some really good sort of stats which listeners may be familiar with already from that Economist article, but I did note them down, that we have the same population as France, but 7 million fewer homes, that if we'd kept pace with building in Western Europe in recent decades, we'd have like 4.5 million more homes than we do right now, that land it constitutes more than 2/3 of the total value of British housing, a much higher percentage than in most other countries. Part of the reason why I think our new build tends to be fairly shoddy and undesirable in many places. And this one actually I think was the real kicker, that between 1980 and 2018, we built more homes in Burnley and Doncaster than we did in Oxford and Cambridge. And this is not to put down Burnley and Doncaster, but if you ask which areas are growing, where is the demand for housing, something has gone horribly wrong there. And so I think what Labour is doing, what the government is doing, as Kristian says, they're toughening up on the housing targets that the Conservatives had relaxed on. They're making some changes to Greenbelt, so trying to pick out things like petrol stations or old industrial areas that can be built on. They're trying to make it easier to redevelop brownfield sites. And yes, they're trying to strip out a lot of the obstructionism through judicial review, through various environmental quangos and so on. That there have been some great stories recently about the way that it's just gumming up the works, like the infamous now £100 million bat tunnel that HS2 has built for no apparent reason. Now, the argument they make in The Economist is that the missing pieces of the picture are effectively a shift from a discretionary planning system to a zoning system, which is one where you would, rather than just deciding individual cases on their merits, you would say, well, you can develop in this area as long as you stick to these rules, and if you stick to them, then fine, the government doesn't need to be involved any more than that. That sounds good. The other point they make, I think, and this is another sensible one, is about local government finance. So if you're in local government at the moment, you see very little upside from permitting a lot of building and attracting a lot more people into your area. If anything, you may see the costs of that, and they won't necessarily be reflected in increased funding. Traditionally, this was not how it worked. When local governments were self-financing, they had a strong incentive to allow building and to bring in more people, because it would increase their revenue quicker than it would increase their costs. Indeed, I learned recently, I may have mentioned it on the podcast before, that in the old days, it wasn't so much that local government couldn't stop you from building. It's just that if they did, they would have to compensate you for the loss of property value. So again, there were very strong financial incentives for the layer of government that was responsible for whether building would happen or not happen. And we've lost that. And in a way, the top-down targets are sort of a response. You've taken away the carrot, so now you just have to have the stick. But the stick, it seems, is not all that effective. So I think that it's a good article. I recommend people read it. I think it makes a sound argument. I think the question, though, is, haven't we been here before? I remember talking about something very similar in 2020, probably. It was when the IEA podcasting was first getting going during the pandemic, and Robert Jemrick was the housing secretary and had ambitious plans to implement effectively a zoning system in Britain. And I can remember all too well saying, well, if this government doesn't achieve anything else, at least they'll fix the planning system. We can rely on that. And no, apparently not, because despite the big majority and despite the rhetoric and the supposed commitment and the economic importance of the issue, it all completely fell apart. And this, I suppose, would be the worry with any such endeavour. And this is not to say, well, it's politically impossible, so don't bother. This has been one of the IEA's most famous mantras going back to the early days, that politically impossible is a question for other people to worry about. It's not a question for us. We follow things through to their logical conclusions based on sound economic reasoning. At the same time, though, there is another strand of IEA work which is all about public choice theory, about the economics of politics and about incentives and interest groups and how policy reforms can overcome them. And I suppose it seems to me this is quite a sound argument, that the full steam ahead imposed zoning, while logically attractive, does fall foul of those institutions' incentives, interest groups arguments, because the problem is we've had nearly 70 years of a system which has empowered NIMBYs, interest groups. You've got all these environmental NGOs that have grown up, basically not specifically to frustrate development, but that is the net outcome. And trying to deal with that head on can be very tricky. So I think some of the areas that are quite promising in planning reform are not so much full frontal assaults, but are more lots of different things that you can do at the margin, which change the incentives, which cut out the interest groups, and hopefully then set in train a much healthier building market.
Yeah, in the long run, of course, we should move to a non-discretionary zoning system where you have fewer local debates over individual cases. In other areas of life where you need permits for particular activities, that's how it works. If you want a driving license, well, there's a set of criteria that you have to fulfill. And if you can demonstrate that you know the traffic rules and that you are able to steer a car, then you will get your license. There's not going to be a neighborhood group where they get consulted. Do you think this person should have a car or should have a permit to drive? Do you think there are enough drivers already in this neighborhood? That's not how it works. It doesn't matter what the community thinks about it. If you can demonstrate that you can drive a car, you get your license, and that's it. It's a rules-based system, not a discretionary one. And it seems crazy that we would organize building permits in such a way that it can be, well, not just that you need a permit, but that the permit can be refused for completely arbitrary reasons. There are no if you apply for a building permit, it's not that you can prepare well in advance to think, okay, what do I need to do to maximize the likelihood of getting approval, because it can be withheld and refused for completely arbitrary reasons that you don't even anticipate. And that's where the discretionary element is so damaging, because that's what it essentially means. It means arbitrariness. It means decision on a whim. And you wouldn't design a permit system in such a way. That being said, a non-discretionary system isn't automatically better. It's not automatically more permissive. So there are parts of California where they do have zoning systems, little discretion around it. There is a fixed set of rules saying you can develop if you comply with, if you take the right boxes, basically, if you comply with criteria X, Y, and Z. It's just that those criteria themselves are highly restrictive. And then the question becomes, right, but who sets the criteria and who draws up the zoning map? And because if they're drawn up by NIMBYs, then, okay, you can have a zoning system where they say, okay, we'll have zones A, B, and C. Zone A, no building. Zone B, no building either. Zone C, definitely no building. And yes, then you have a non-discretionary zoning system, but it wouldn't improve anything. And then it would be even better if you had some arbitrariness in the system.
And it can be worse than that. I mean, zoning is still a form of planning. Now, you could have one zone, which is you can develop up to, say, a certain height limit as long as it's not liable to catch fire. And that's effectively what London was like, exaggerating slightly, but before the First World War. That's kind of a rules-based system. It's very straightforward. But what you also got in the 20th century was the development of, I suppose, quite complicated zoning systems where you're trying to do economic planning at the same time as creating rules-based development systems. So it's like, well, this is going to be our commercial district, and this is going to be for like retail and leisure, and we'll put housing over here. And what you got was basically these very sterile communities that just didn't work, or at least if they did work immediately, they weren't adaptable and they weren't robust, and you end up with kind of empty, rundown retail districts because people are shopping online, or empty office districts because, well, maybe a lot more people are working from home now, and you get people living in the residential communities, which maybe become very boring and very car dependent and so on and so forth. And you lose what you probably would get in a spontaneous order, which is the unpredictable pattern of everything mixing together in a way that over time will satisfy consumer preferences. And that is so much better than any kind of planned system. And that's sort of the way we need to go. I mean, one example of this, I was talking about the various sort of side-on attacks you can make on the planning system to try and encourage more market-led building. One example of zoning is strategic industrial land in London. So there is a huge swathe of land in West London around Park Royal, which is incredibly transport rich, and especially with HS2 and the Elizabeth Line and everything. That's an absolutely fantastic place for massive residential and retail, everything else development, right? That could be almost an entirely new neighbourhood of London, provide tons of homes. It's very well connected. It's very well positioned, etc., etc. At the moment, it's basically boxland. A lot of it is single-storey warehousing, right? And it's not that you don't need that in cities, but do you need it there? But because it's been designated strategic industrial land, and it's not the only example in London where you have basically a wildly inefficient use of a scarce resource, because at some point in the past, the government has decided, well, this looks like a good place for this. It's frozen forever. And then, of course, you develop all the kind of interest groups around it who try to protect the status quo. And the people who would benefit from change, well, first of all, they probably don't know who they are in advance. And even if they did, those benefits are spread fairly thinly over a wide group of people. Yeah.
It's absolutely textbook, isn't it? I mean, I just want to before we move on, although we are running out of time, think about, or just ask the question, it's not always been like this, has it? I mean, in the UK, we've got this unbelievably centralised restrictive planning system. And at this point, it's quite, and up until recently, it's been, we can't even touch it politically, that would be a nightmare. But although that's shifting slightly, but still it's accepted that this is the way it's always been, but it's not, is it? Kristian, can you just give us a bit of a rundown of pre-1947 Town and Country Planning Act? What was the system? How did it work in broad strokes? And what changed?
Yeah, well, I mean, there has been a planning system of sorts for centuries, or maybe not a nationwide one, but local planning. It's not that there was ever a time, well, unless you go maybe back to the Middle Ages or something, where anyone can build anything anywhere. There's never a free-for-all, but there was just a default assumption that if you own land, you have a right to build on it, because it is your property, and that's how property rights work, right? That if you own something, you decide what to do with it, unless you harm someone else. And there can then be some exemptions to this right, where there are externalities, where what you do with your land clearly affects people around you. And therefore, that was never an absolute right. But the default assumption is you own it, you decide whether you want to build on it. And reversing that default assumption, moving from a system where building is allowed unless specifically prohibited, to a system where building is, to begin with, prohibited unless specifically allowed. That was the big change of 1947. And in itself, that doesn't have to mean that you produce a housing crisis. So I don't think the planners at the time or the policymakers at the time could have anticipated that. It's just that it was, the danger was there right from the start, and it did develop later in that way because, well, it was now possible, and then NIMBY resistance formed, and that if you then also have a fiscal centralization tendency, meaning less and less of an incentive at the local level to approve development or pretty much any kind of economic activity, and that combined with that discretionary element that I mentioned, then you get an explosive mix. So that's how you get that problem.
And that really is the bottom line here, I think. Fundamentally, you have to shift the burden of proof back where it belongs. Yeah. And it should be on government or whatever authority it is to show clearly why some kind of building is inappropriate or harmful. But in the absence of that, then it should be the right of the property owners to develop their property as they see fit. And of course, I think this is one of those crucial things that often gets missed, that one of the reasons people feel you need all of these restrictive rules on development, on the form of the building and everything else, is because the market is so constrained. Consumers are not in charge, right? This is not really a consumer-led system in any meaningful way. In most markets, the rules can be like fairly light touch, and you can be confident that producers will produce the kind of things that consumers want to buy. There is a sense that isn't the case in housing. I think that probably, has a ring of truth to it, unfortunately. But it is precisely because there is so little developable land available because of the planning system, and because most of the value of the ultimate housing product is in the land itself and not what's built on top of it, that it's just a system which is squarely not designed to satisfy what the consumers of housing want.
Yes, even on the relatively pro-housing side, I often hear this argument, say, on pro-development leaning conservatives. They'd often say, well, but you do need a design code, right? Because otherwise developers will just build lots of ugly housing. And that does make you wonder, okay, do we need a design code for cars? Is it not in the interest of a car manufacturer to build the kind of car that people find visually appealing, apart from the functionality? And what is so different? Do we need design codes for clothing or furniture? Normally that's such part of the product, and therefore it's in your best interest to design it in such a way that people like it.
Yeah. We clearly don't have a design code on our clothing that is molded ours. So,
slightly different interpretations of it, isn't there? I completely agree with all of that. And the interesting issue with it, bringing it back to the sort of the current climate, is that it is somewhere where the government is looking to make some progress from a pro-growth standpoint. Whether there is going to be enough progress is the big question mark. But then on the other side, just to move on to our last topic, the other side of what the government's doing, that doesn't seem nearly as pro-growth, is on their employment rights bill. So this is they call the biggest upgrade in workers' rights in a generation. This week they have announced some further amendments to the bill. So there was some briefing in, just beforehand that they dropped some of the more radical stuff. But actually, what it turned out to be was, yes, one or two things had been left out, but the amendments were, again, more powers to unions. It was making it easier to strike, and one element that not only are they moving the opt-in to donate political funds as part of your union membership to an opt-out, they're now removing the requirement to check in once every 10 years to say, do you sure you still want to keep donating to the political actions of your union? So thereby filling their own coffers as well. So all sorts of question marks. Tom, what's your view on it in the macro sense?
Well, I think it's a bit of a misnomer to call it the greatest expansion of employment rights in a generation, or whatever they're saying. This isn't really for the workers. I think this is for the unions who bankroll the political party. And, I don't like to talk about things in those very broad terms, but, I can't really believe that they get away with something so transparent as changing the opt-in to political donation into an opt-out, making it the default for union members to effectively give money to the Labour Party who are in government, and then to remove the requirement that the unions have to kind of re-up that commitment on a 10-year basis.
Every decade.
Yeah. I mean, this was not exactly a major constraint on unions supporting the Labour Party. This does seem very dodgy, and I think if other political parties tried to pull the same trick, they would be pulled up on it, and rightly so. So I think it should apply just as much to the current government as to everybody else. I mean, I was amused to see that our colleague Len Shackleton wrote a piece for CapEx about this week. He noted that it was 191 pages long, the bill at the current moment. I think he said that the full title was 125 words long. And I think what that speaks to is that this isn't a bill advancing a coherent policy agenda based on a set of principles. This is basically a massive sort of omnibus filled with everything that various interest groups have demanded the government deliver in exchange for their financial and political support.
This is their price, isn't it? This is their price for the financial support for the
And I think that's why, even though, and I'm sure there are plenty of people in the government who realise this because it's not difficult, even though they realise that this runs completely contrary to their pro-growth agenda, even though they've been sort of bending over backwards or on their knees begging businesses since the somewhat disastrous budget last year to say, no, I know that was rough on business, but we're not going to do any more of that, I promise. It's all done now. And yet here comes the employment bill, which, taken on top of the rise in corporation tax and the higher minimum wage and the increase in employers' national insurance contributions, it makes it just so much less attractive to employ anybody, especially at the lower end of the wage spectrum. The government knows this. They're not stupid, but they feel compelled to do it anyway. And this is just one of those things. And look, I mean, you can point the same kind of accusation, I think, at the Conservative Party and say, they know that you need more building. They know that you need to liberalise the planning system. They know that the Green Belt is a foolish idea that throttles the economy. But it's their price of admission as a political party to prevent building in the green and leafy shires, right? Shouldn't be that way, but it is. I think, unfortunately, the price of admission for Labour is to a certain extent, we've got to do what the unions tell us. And that is what this looks like to me.
What do you think will be the impact? Sorry, go on.
Well, yes, it's going to be, we already have a problem with rising economic inactivity, and this is certainly not the time at which you want to bring in an act like this. And it's generally been the case, even though we've had nearly 1.5 decades of a stagnant economy. The one thing that was working quite well, despite the bad macroeconomic situation, was the British labour market. One of the few remaining success stories that at times of very little to no growth and a growing population, you still had enough job creation and the labour market was able to absorb a lot of newcomers. And so that was the one area where I say, well, if it ain't broke, don't fix it and stay away from it. And this would have been true at pretty much any moment, but now it seems to be just about the worst time to meddle with the labour market.
Yeah. And I think, frankly, the Conservative Party and government opened the floodgates on a lot of this stuff by what I would see as a very cynical approach to the minimum wage. Having opposed its introduction at all, they then decided to become its biggest fans and raise it way above the rate of inflation, sort of to prove a point. And in a way, sometimes these kind of taboos appear in politics, right? And one of them, I think, for Labour was, well, people don't trust us on employment rights. They think that we're too close to the unions. They remember the industrial strife of the 1970s, or at least they've heard tell of it. So this is one of those things. It's just a bit dangerous for us to do because it gives the wrong impression. A bit like Conservatives feel like, oh, well, we can't cut taxes for rich people because that will play into political perceptions of us. But I think in a way, the things the Conservative did on employment rights and particularly on the minimum wage just normalised it all again. It made it so that a different government can come in and say, well, why not? The other side were doing it too.
Well, hopefully, I think that's absolutely correct. And I think this is probably one of the most damaging, if not the most damaging thing that the government is currently doing to the economy. But
that net zero.
Well, yes. Well, yes. Let's not start listing because we'll be here forever. But I mean, hopefully, to end on a point of optimism, maybe the aforementioned planning, sort of appetite on planning stuff, means that they are normalising some fairly radical in the context, not IEA radical, but radical in the context reforms to the planning system.
Yeah.
Hopefully, whoever comes in next, whoever is the next government elected, now can sort of build on that progress in a more positive sense, and perhaps the union legislation in particular, not necessarily employment rights, but the union legislation in particular, may continue to be a bit of a pendulum depending on whoever's in, because the Tories, although they did on the minimum wage, did do lots of that and normalise a lot of this. They also sort of limited powers of strike and brought in minimum services legislation, which is now being repealed by the Labour Party. So maybe that will continue to be a football. But hopefully ground is shifting on the planning where it might, in the right way, where it's shifting the wrong way on employment rights. I think that's all we've got time for, I'm afraid. Thank you for listening, as always. As mentioned, if you want to hear more, then subscribe to our Substack, Institute of Economic Affairs Insider, and we'll put the links to the articles we discussed today in the description below. Until next time, thanks very much.